Imagine 500 of the most elite warriors from the Aztec Empire, dressed in jaguar suits and armed with obsidian bladed weapons, suddenly appearing outside the Pentagon. Could they storm America's military headquarters? This sounds like the setup for a movie, but today we're going to examine this matchup with real history, engineering facts, and modern security realities. Before we dive in, let's be clear about something important. This is purely educational. We're not discussing any actual vulnerabilities or providing instructions for anything. All the information we're using comes from publicly available sources like official government reports, historical records, and academic studies. We're keeping this at a high level and staying responsible throughout. So, who were these Jaguar Warriors and what made them so special? In the Aztec world of the 14th to 16th centuries, the Jaguar Warriors stood at the top of the military hierarchy. They were part of an elite warrior society, grouped together with eagle warriors under the nahuatl term macuahuitl. The jaguar wasn't just an animal to the Aztecs, it was a symbol of power, strength, and the night itself. When you earned the right to call yourself a Jaguar Warrior, you had proven yourself as one of the most fearsome fighters in all of Mesoamerica. The path to becoming a Jaguar Warrior was no joke. Aztec society had two main educational tracks for young men. If you were a commoner, you attended the Topocali, which translates to the House of Youth. This wasn't like a regular school. From a young age, boys underwent intense physical conditioning, discipline training, and learned to use various weapons. We're talking about slings, bows, the famous macuahuitl sword, and the atlatl or spear thrower. The noble sons went to a different school called the Calmacac, where they got military leadership training combined with education in religion, law, and the complex Aztec calendar system. These details come from primary sources like the Florentine Codex compiled by Sagun and the Codex Mendoza. The whole Aztec education system was built around creating warriors. Boys grew up knowing that serving in a war was expected, that battlefield prowess was the main way to gain honor and social mobility, and that military success could even lead to political office. The schools reinforced this with strict discipline that would make modern boot camps look soft. Now, let's talk about what these warriors carried into battle. The most famous weapon was the macuahuitl, a wooden club that looks kind of like a sword but with razor-sharp obsidian blades embedded along the edges. Obsidian is volcanic glass, and when it breaks, it can create edges sharper than most modern surgical steel. We're talking about a weapon that could cause devastating cuts. They also used the atlatl, which is basically a lever that lets you throw a dart or small spear with much more force than your arm alone could manage. Think of it like an ancient force multiplier. For longer range weapons, they had various spears and polearms called topatztopili. For protection, Jaguar warriors wore something called ishkawipali, which was armor made from densely quilted cotton. That might sound weak to modern ears, but this stuff was surprisingly effective against the weapons of their time. It could stop arrows, atlatl darts, and slashing weapons while being lightweight and relatively cheap to produce. They also carried round shields called chimali, often decorated with colorful designs and symbols. The visual appearance of these warriors was meant to intimidate. When you see pictures from ancient codices or modern reconstructions, you'll see them in full jaguar suits with distinctive headpieces. But here's something interesting that the education site Mexico Lore points out. Most of these jaguar suits weren't made from actual jaguar pelts. They were textile and feather constructions designed to represent the animal. It was symbolic costume, not literal animal skin. There's a common claim you'll hear that captures the promotion system. Many sources say that capturing 4 enemies alive would elevate you into the jaguar or eagle orders. This number appears in a lot of educational materials and secondary literature, though historians note that the exact thresholds varied across different sources and time periods. The key point isn't the specific number, but the cultural reality behind it. The Aztecs placed enormous value on taking captives alive. This fed into their ritual obligations and reinforced state power. Warriors weren't just trying to kill enemies, they were trying to disable them and drag them back for capture. This capture-focused mindset shaped their entire tactical approach. Chronicles from the period describe lots of wrestling, grappling, and strategic use of weapons to maim and weaken rather than outright kill. The macuahuitl's design makes sense in this context. You could deliver crippling blows that would take someone out of the fight without necessarily killing them immediately. So, what would 500 of these elite warriors represent? In terms of Aztec campaigns, this would actually be a relatively small force. But within their own technological context, this would be formidable. Many of these men would be veterans with strong unit cohesion, deeply committed to their religious duties, and conditioned for courage and endurance. They would move together on foot, each carrying their personal weapons and shields, optimized for close quarters fighting and missile volleys at pre-firearm ranges. They would have no radios, no gunpowder weapons, and no modern protective equipment. They would expect to close with the enemy to take captives. Put simply, 500 Jaguar Warriors equals 500 highly trained, incredibly brave melee infantry, optimized for a 16th century Mesoamerican battlefield. Now, let's look at what they'd be facing. The Pentagon is the headquarters of the United States Department of Defense, located in Arlington, Virginia. This building is absolutely massive. An official DoD financial report from 2020 gives us the hard numbers. 17.5 miles of hallways, roughly 3 times the floor space of the Empire State Building, and about 26,000 employees working in the complex on a normal day. This isn't just a building, it's basically a small city dedicated to military operations. The Pentagon was built in a hurry during World War II and has since become not just a working headquarters but a national symbol. Official histories from the Office of the Secretary of Defense emphasize how it functions as building, institution, and symbol all at once. It's an engineering achievement that became the nerve center of the modern Department of Defense. So, who protects this massive complex? Day-to-day protection falls to the Pentagon Force Protection Agency, or PFPA. This is a dedicated DoD agency whose public website describes its mission as protecting those who protect our nation. The PFPA handles law enforcement, anti-terrorism, and force protection, protective intelligence, and response to chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear threats, and explosives. These responsibilities are spelled out in the agency's own mission statements and in DoD budget documents that describe their work in the National Capital Region. The legal authority for all this is codified into federal law. Title 10 of the U.S. Code, Section 2674, tasks the Secretary of Defense with protecting DoD buildings and people on the property in the National Capital Region. Public federal regulations for conduct on the Pentagon reservation are laid out in Title 32 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 234. These are the high-level legal authorities that establish this as a secure federal facility subject to federal law and enforcement. One event taught us a lot about the Pentagon as a physical structure. On September 11, 2001, the western side of the building was attacked. The American Society of Civil Engineers led a building performance study, and the DoD renovation program published detailed reports on what happened. These materials are public and they highlight something crucial. At the time of the attack, a portion of the building called Wedge 1 had recently undergone renovation with blast-resistant features. This included thicker blast-resistant windows, steel reinforcement, and aramid fiber layers between window frames. According to DoD's own renovation report, these features likely reduced casualties and delayed collapse, buying critical time for people to evacuate. The ASCE materials explain these structural performance findings in professional engineering terms. This body of engineering research underscores an important point. The Pentagon isn't just a big office building. It's been renovated and hardened in ways to appropriate a secure, critical federal headquarters. Those details are publicly documented at a broad level, though obviously we're not going to discuss any specific security measures. Now, let's set up this hypothetical scenario with some sensible ground rules. First, no anachronistic upgrades for the Jaguar Warriors. They have their historical weapons like the macuahuitl, atlatl, and spears. They have their shields and cotton armor. They don't get firearms, explosives, radios, vehicles, or modern protective gear. Their doctrine's built around close quarters action and capturing enemies, not standoff engagement. Second, modern U.S. law enforcement and security respond using lawful methods and modern tools. We're not going to discuss exact policies or procedures, but it's obvious from public sources that the Pentagon is a secure facility with a dedicated federal protection agency and connections to surrounding jurisdictions. Third, the environment. This happens in the real world around Arlington, Virginia. That means road networks, public visibility, and rapid police response. The Pentagon isn't a remote fortress in a jungle. It's a high-profile building inside the National Capital Region with intense law enforcement presence and surveillance typical of such a place. Fourth, an ethical limit. We're not going to describe tactical routing or specific layout details. We're not offering advice that can help anyone bypass security. What follows is high-level reasoning based on the public facts we've laid out. Let's talk about the raw mismatch in technology, range, and lethality. The macuahuitl is genuinely fascinating and fearsome. Its obsidian blades can inflict devastating cuts, but compared to modern firearms, its effective range is basically arm's length. Even with an atlatl, you're talking about tens of meters of practical effect against an alert, armed opponent, and that's only if you can get them exposed and vulnerable. Obsidian can achieve an incredibly sharp edge, sharp enough that obsidian blades are sometimes used in controlled laboratory or surgical settings. But obsidian's also brittle. Those edges chip and shatter on hard impact. The weapon's wooden body and glued-on blades are no match for steel or modern materials. In a modern confrontation, Jaguar Warriors would face defenders with standoff capability, precision, and repeatable fire at distances where melee specialists simply cannot close. General references make clear that while obsidian is razor-sharp, it's also fragile. Historical accounts of the Spanish conquest of Mexico illustrate how gunpowder weapons and steel armor overmatched traditional Mesoamerican arms, even when the Aztecs had superior numbers and fought with incredible ferocity. Think about command, control, and communications. Aztec armies communicated through runners, drums, conch horns, and standards. These were effective in their own context, but in a modern urban setting, they would have no radios, no shared map, no situational awareness of converging units from multiple agencies. They'd be visible and slow-moving, which means modern responders could coordinate containment in minutes. The importance of communications to modern law enforcement is obvious. The Pentagon's protection is run by a federal agency with exactly this mission as its entire reason for existing. Military and logistics present another massive problem. The Jaguar forces move on foot, carrying personal equipment and maybe a handful of provisions. In an urbanized area, that makes them predictable and quickly contained. They lack vehicles, breaching tools, or heavy equipment. They can't outmaneuver patrol cars, barricades, or controlled perimeters. In terms of sustainment, even a few hours without resupply would exhaust a massive melee infantry under stress. None of this is meant as an insult to Jaguar Warriors. It's simply the wrong toolkit for a modern security environment. Now, let's consider the human factor. Everything we know about Aztec military culture tells us these were hardened, courageous fighters with a robust sense of duty and honor. The Teocalli system produced soldiers conditioned to endure pain and act in tightly choreographed group combat. That matters enormously for morale and initial contact. These weren't random civilians. They were professional warriors with extensive training. The culture shock would be extreme. Even if some had seen 16th century arquebuses or cannon, nothing in the Jaguar Warriors world prepared them for the sights and sounds of the modern Pentagon environment. We're talking about vehicles, aircraft, sirens, radios, loudspeakers, bright strobes, less lethal devices, and if sadly necessary, modern firearms with immense rates of fire and accuracy. Aztec warriors were not strangers to fear or combat stress, but sensory overload in a modern urban security response would be profound. Their doctrine of closing distance to capture would be practically impossible to execute against standoff defenses. Intent matters here, and this is where their cultural approach collides with modern law, because the Jaguar Order prizes capturing enemies rather than simply killing them. They'd likely attempt to close with individuals and subdue them. But on a secure federal reservation, even approaching in large numbers with weapons visible would trigger rapid law enforcement intervention under well-established legal authorities. The public statutes and regulations we mentioned earlier make clear this is protected space with federal enforcement. The building itself and its environment create massive obstacles. First, there's the sheer scale. As an office complex, the Pentagon is immense. Millions of square feet, a labyrinth of corridors, and enough interior depth to keep most operations far from exterior spaces. That official description we mentioned earlier reiterates those metrics. 17.5 miles of hallways and about 26,000 personnel. That alone means an external, pre-industrial force cannot overwhelm the building by mass at the entrance. This isn't a gatehouse or palisade that you can storm with enough brave men. It's an enormous complex where most activity happens deep inside, far from any exterior access point. The hardened, renovated structure matters too. The September 11th engineering reports remind us that this building is stoutly constructed and has undergone hardening upgrades. This obviously isn't a medieval curtain wall, but the combination of reinforced concrete, modern glazing, and renovated sectors means the structure has resilience under stress far beyond anything a melee force could exploit. The ASCE Building Performance Report and DoD renovation documents provide the broad brush public evidence for this. The urban policing environment is another critical factor. The Pentagon sits within a dense web of jurisdictions and roadways. It's patrolled by its own federal agency, plus the usual network of surrounding public safety partners. Without getting into operational specifics, the key reality is that response would be fast and containment would likely be multi-layered. All of that follows from simple public facts. The PFPA exists, and the Pentagon is a protected federal facility in the National Capital Region. Let's imagine what contact would actually look like, keeping this intentionally general. In the first 10 minutes, 500 conspicuously dressed armed warriors cannot blend in anywhere near modern Arlington. Their presence would trigger public reporting long before they reach any sensitive area. The PFPA's public mission makes it clear it has law enforcement authority and a duty to protect the reservation and people on it. That naturally implies early response and coordination. Initial law enforcement engagement would begin outside sensitive areas with verbal commands and a show of force from trained officers. The scenario would be handled as a public safety emergency. Given the obvious mismatch, any effort by the Jaguar force to close with officers would be met by graduated response up to the lawful use of deadly force if necessary to protect life. Containment would happen quickly. Realistically, a large group armed with melee weapons would be contained by vehicles, barriers, and a perimeter. Modern law enforcement's trained to manage and compartmentalize groups of people. Without modern breaching tools or mobility, the Jaguar force would have no way to push through sustained, coordinated standoff defense. After the first clash, some fraction of the attacking group would likely be detained in the initial chaos. Many would become disoriented under sustained auditory and visual stressors and an overwhelming show of force. Attempts to press and attack would lead to casualties among the attackers almost immediately. The situation would degrade from an organized push into dispersal and either surrender or incapacitation. Notice how none of this requires operational detail. It simply follows from what happens when modern policing faces a pre-industrial melee formation in broad daylight. History provides some lessons here. When the Spanish invaded central Mexico in the early 16th century, they brought a combined arms package new to Mesoamerica. Steel swords and lances, crossbows and early firearms, cavalry and metal armor, fighting alongside massive numbers of indigenous allies. Even with all the caveats about disease, alliance politics, and the Aztecs' own strategic misjudgments, the technology gap mattered enormously. Authoritative summaries stress how Aztec weapons and armor compared poorly to steel and gunpowder in direct fights. The macuahuitl, bows, spears, cloth armor, and hide-covered shields led to severe disadvantages, despite Aztec numbers and incredible ferocity. That was 5 centuries ago. The gap between macuahuitl plus atlatl and modern firearms and protective equipment absolutely dwarfs the 16th century mismatch. And unlike the Spanish campaigns, where Aztec forces could find cover in causewayed cities and fight in masses across lake and chinampa environments, the Pentagon setting gives the attackers no terrain advantage whatsoever. Their straits get flipped upside down. Shock value, visual intimidation, and close-in skill become liabilities against modern visibility, surveillance, and standoff capacity. Why is even 500 nowhere near enough? Even if we granted every favorable assumption to the Jaguars, perfect morale, flawless cohesion, and ideal conditions, the following problems are insurmountable. Range is the first killer. They cannot touch defenders who can engage from distance. Penetration second. Cotton armor and shields are not ballistic protection. Obsidian shatters on hard modern surfaces and armor. Mobility's third. On foot, a mass of 500 can be blocked and corralled by vehicles and barriers in minutes. Command and control is fourth. They have no radios, no shared picture of the battlefield. Modern responders do. Sustainment is fifth. They cannot sustain an action in a hostile cityscape against trained armed professionals. For perspective, remember that the Pentagon building alone contains miles of corridors and tens of thousands of personnel. The notion that 500 melee fighters could storm, search, and control any meaningful fraction of it is logistically absurd. There's also a culture clash in terms of intent. Jaguar doctrine values capture, which in their world brings honor and ritual value. In a modern setting, Any visible attempt to seize people on or near a federal reservation is a felony assault that triggers immediate, coordinated law enforcement response. The attackers' goals and methods don't just fail tactically, they collide head-on with a security and legal system built to stop exactly that behavior. The DOJ and DoD legal environment makes clear the Pentagon is protected space. Protecting persons on the property is a statutory duty. It's important to separate respect for the Jaguar Warriors from myth-making. Their courage, skill, and status in Aztec society were absolutely real. The weapons were ingenious in their context. The obsidian-edged sword was a clever solution optimized for a battlefield where capture and disabling were paramount, not armor-piercing lethality against steel. Elite suits, headdresses, and shields created a powerful visual language meant to intimidate enemies and inspire friends. This is accurately captured in codex imagery, with the caveat that many Jaguar suits were textile and feather representations rather than literal pelts. And the Aztec schooling system reminds us these were professionals, not a rabble. Modern audiences sometimes latch on to sensational tales. For example, the macuahuitl decapitating a horse. Early chroniclers indeed recorded such anecdotes, and experimental archaeology shows the weapon's cutting potential on soft targets. But such stories, colorful as they are, don't change the strategic conclusion here. Obsidian-edged wooden swords are lethal at arm's length, not at 100 meters, and they're brittle versus modern armor and structures. People often imagine the Pentagon as a fortress. In reality, it's a workplace that thousands of military and civilian professionals use every day. Public DoD materials and tour literature refer to its size, its 6 zip codes, its food court and shops, but it's also unquestionably a secure federal facility with a dedicated protection agency and explicit statutory authority to protect people and property on the reservation. That duality actually underlines why a mass of pre-industrial fighters would be identified and contained before they came anywhere close to anything sensitive. Open enough for a regular workday and protected as a national defense headquarters. If we project the timeline more specifically, staying general, in minutes 0 through 10 you'd see visibility and reports, PFPA and partner units deploying, and perimeters forming. In minutes 10 through 30, orders would be issued, containment established, non-compliant movement would meet escalating force, and detentions would begin. Beyond 30 minutes, the attacking formation would break into pockets, exhaustion and injuries would compound the deterrence, and surrender or incapacitation would end the event. At no point does a melee armed force gain access to or hold any part of a hardened, policed federal headquarters. It's not a boast, it's that predictable outcome of range, law, logistics, and coordination. Let's look at this as a comparison. On one side, Jaguar Warriors, elite melee and light missile infantry in a capture-oriented doctrine, armed with macuahuitl, atlatl darts, spears, and polearms. Protected by quilted cotton armor and round shields, communicating through human runners, horns, drums, and standards. Moving on foot with no vehicles or modern breaching tools, with an objective to close, capture, and display valor. On the other side, Pentagon defenders, federal law enforcement and protection at a secure headquarters with layered response and partners as needed. Equipped with modern standoff capabilities, vehicles, radios, and trained tactics following a lawful use of force continuum. Protected by hardened building sections with modern materials, engineering resilience, and legal authorities to secure the site. Communicating through radios, command centers, and interagency coordination. Rapid mobility by vehicle with control of routes and barricade capability with an objective to protect people and property and prevent or stop unlawful acts. These rows aren't comparable. One is optimized for hand-to-hand prowess in a 16th century theater, the other is optimized for 21st century protection of a critical headquarters. There are only 2 plausible outcomes to this scenario. The first and best case with the least harm. Faced with an overwhelming show of modern force and commands they can't process in their own cultural terms, the Jaguar force halts or withdraws, is contained, and is taken into custody with minimal casualties. The second outcome, if they charge. A mismatch in range and lethality ends the clash quickly, with injuries or deaths among the attackers and detention of survivors. No penetration of the building occurs in either scenario. Either way, victory for the attacking force is impossible. You can't capture what you can't reach, and you can't reach what is protected by standoff tools you can't counter. Versus hypotheticals like this might seem frivolous at first, They can actually teach real history. They highlight the logic of a weapon system. The macuahuitl was brilliant for its environment, producing crippling cuts while preserving the chance to capture. It was never designed to break steel plate, defeat ballistics, or win a gunfight at 100 meters. They illuminate institutional missions. The Pentagon's fundamentally a workplace, but one with a publicly stated protection mission and legal authority to enforce it. They remind us that engineering matters. The building's performance and post-attack renovations aren't abstract. They represent lessons learned, investment, and durability. A band of 500 Jaguar Warriors would be terrifying in their own time and place. They were elite soldiers of a major civilization. Their discipline and courage deserve respect. Their weapons show real ingenuity within their cultural aims. But against the Pentagon, understood as a modern federal headquarters with a protection mission, staff, and legal authority, the outcome isn't in doubt. The range, coordination, mobility, and legal framework of modern security end the scenario almost as soon as it begins. The Jaguar's close-in brilliance has no distance at which to matter. That's not a judgment of worth. It's a consequence of technology, institution, and law.